Every now and then I like to reflect on moments in history from the Bulls franchise, things that could have been, what would have changed for the team had they gone in a different direction, or even some measly regular season wins or losses that could have altered the trajectory of the franchise. And while there is a lot that we can reflect on between the missed timeout call and David Blatt in 2015 in the semi-conference finals against the Cavs, or of course the age-old what if Derrick Rose never got injured, what would have happened to this team, or if they were able to land LeBron James in 2010 in free agency. But there is one moment that is often forgot about. A brief period in time in an otherwise meaningless season at the start of the Bulls' rebuild after trading away Jimmy Butler, and one man in particular who completely altered what otherwise would have led to the Bulls landing a franchise-level player, a generational talent that the team could have built around for decades, and I'm here to talk about it. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. You all know it by now. It was one of the biggest and more shocking trades in Bulls franchise history when they decided to move on from their best player, a player who was in the peak of his prime at just the age of 27 in Jimmy Butler. I'll never forget that day on draft night in 2017, realizing that the era of the Bulls that went from Derrick Rose to Jimmy Butler era had officially come to a close and the franchise was going to be going into a rebuild. As a Bulls fan since I was a kid in the 90s and having to live through the dark days of the post-dynasty era, the thought of going through a rebuild, another one, sounded miserable to me. But unlike those days in the early 2000s, as an adult now and understanding the game more on the business side of the league, I could somewhat get behind going into a rebuild and embracing the tank, especially given the projected talents that were set to enter the NBA draft in 2018. And while I've never been a fan of tanking because no matter how much you lose, a top pick is never guaranteed, there was something to be said about having a bad year and increasing your odds at a generational level talent. And while Jimmy Butler, the trade netted the Bulls Lauri Markkanen, Chris Dunn, and Zach Lavine, Lavine was going to be missing most of the season coming back from an ACL injury, who was assumed to be the Bulls' best player after the trade. Markkanen, while we knew that the talent was there and he was going to be a great player, but leading them to a bunch of wins as a rookie was going to be unlikely. And Chris Dunn, while a solid talent at that time, wasn't going to suddenly be leading to a lot of wins for this team. With a projected starting lineup of Robin Lopez, Lauri Markkanen, Nikola Mirotic, Justin Holiday, and Chris Dunn, you knew this team was going to be losing a lot of games. And that was compounded even further when Bobby Portis took embracing the tank into his own hands by punching one of the Bulls' best players in Nikola Mirotic in training camp to the point where it would sideline Mirotic into December and miss the first 23 games of the season. The Bulls would go 3-20 in that 23-game time span, good enough for being the worst team in the league, and it would be the worst start to a season in franchise history since the first post-dynasty era in 1999 for the Chicago Bulls. The Bulls were awful, and while it was painful to watch on a nightly basis, there was a silver lining in that an 18-year-old kid by the name of Luka Doncic was turning heads when he was dominating a league of grown men overseas in the EuroLeague, becoming the youngest MVP in EuroLeague history. His combined skills of being able to generate points by scoring himself or assisting in scoring, but also the size and rebounding ability of a power forward were next level and something we hadn't seen since the days of Magic Johnson. I wanted this kid on the Bulls. Everything about him screamed a franchise-altering player, the next superstar and face of the league that would bring the Bulls back to relevancy and make for a quick rebuild to stop this pain of watching a G League level team on a nightly basis. And then Nikola Mirotic returned. Mirotic was finally cleared to play in the 24th game of the season in limited minutes coming off the bench, and the Bulls would end a 10-game losing streak by defeating the Charlotte Hornets in overtime. And while Nico didn't play much in that game, only scoring 6 points on 2 for 7 shooting, once he entered the starting lineup again 2 games later, Mirotic would single-handedly wipe the Bulls out of a chance of finishing as a bottom 3 team in the NBA by averaging over 23 points per game over the next 7 games on near 55% shooting and 10 rebounds per game, which would lead the Bulls in going on a 7-game winning streak, putting their record at 10-20. Mirotic had 2 of the highest game scores of his career during that winning streak and would hit big shots in the fourth quarter to put the Bulls over the top in securing a W. The Bulls would go on to win 10 of their 12 games since the return of Mirotic, with him leading the team in scoring during that time period. Mirotic was leading the Bulls to winning so many games that the front office had no choice but to trade him at the deadline so they could get the tank back on track and start losing consistently again. But by that point, it was too late. By the time Mirotic was traded, the Bulls were 18-33, which was still bad, but not bad enough to be one of the worst teams in the league, as every tanking team that year, and there was a lot of them, every loss was paramount. And with a record of 18-33, there was no way the Bulls were going to lose enough games before the end of the season to beat out teams like the Phoenix Suns, the Memphis Grizzlies, or even the Atlanta Hawks and the Dallas Mavericks. Zach LaVine had also returned by that time to the lineup, which would make matters worse when it came to losing as LaVine took over on offense after Mirotic was moved. The Bulls would ultimately finish the season 27-55, good enough for being tied for the 6th worst record in the league with the Sacramento Kings, and the 6th highest odds of moving into the top 3 of the lottery after winning the coin flip tiebreaker over the Kings, since at that time you could only move up into the top 3 rather than top 4 like it is today. The Bulls would get even more unlucky though, as winning that coin flip would actually cost them dearly and alter the fate of the franchise, as the Sacramento Kings, who now had the 7th best odds of moving into the top 3, would in fact jump the Bulls and land with the number 2 pick in the 2018 draft, sending the Bulls back to number 7, which the Bulls would later use to select Wendell Carter Jr. A tanking year, a year in which the Bulls started off the season 3-20, would net them Wendell Carter Jr., a solid player, but I think we can all agree is not franchise-altering or a superstar in the making by any means. Now, obviously, the Kings would botch their number 2 pick, and that was probably one of the worst decisions in franchise history by drafting Marvin Bagley over Luka, which is a very Kings thing to do with the history of their missed lottery picks. And while we don't know if the Bulls would have in fact drafted Luka had they finished with the number 2 pick, or even the number 1 or number 3 pick for that matter, but even if just losing a few more games and snagging players like Trae Young or Jaren Jackson Jr. over Wendell Carter Jr. would have been a huge come up for the Bulls and their future, if it just hadn't been for Nikola Mirotic deciding to ball out in that brief period before being traded at the deadline. And this is no disrespect to Mirotic, by the way, because I actually loved Mirotic when he was on the Bulls. His ability to space the floor as a big that could also rebound and be a big part of the Bulls' overall offense, especially in that 2015 season, the last year of Tom Thibodeau when the Bulls really needed offense. And to be fair, it's a bit dramatic of me to say that Mirotic himself alone ruined the Bulls and their chances to land a player like Luka Doncic, because it is a team sport. The team started playing well. They weren't bad enough to be one of the worst teams in the NBA. And at the end of the day, players are going to play their best. They're playing for contracts. They're fighting for playing time. They're wanting the headlines and the recognition. A player is never going to intentionally play bad when they're on the court, unless you're James Harden when he's trying to get traded. And so we can't sit here and blame Mirotic for playing the game of basketball. And at the end of the day, even if the Bulls had lost a few more games or they even finished with the worst record in the league, there was still never a guarantee that they would have landed with a top 3 pick, even though we now know that 2 of the bottom 3 teams finished with a top 3 pick. And in addition to that, the fact that Luka Doncic, who ultimately fell to number 3, he was traded to the team who had the number 5 pick in the Dallas Mavericks, who exchanged their pick and selection in Trae Young, as well as a future first-round pick for him. And the Bulls could have tried to get a little more aggressive in trading their number 7 pick and potentially 1 or 2 future first-round picks, or even including Malik Markkanen in that time, to make it enticing enough for the Hawks to trade their pick to the Bulls instead of to the Mavs, even though the Hawks were really going after Trae Young. So while we can moan and think of what could have been had the Bulls not gone on that winning streak back in December of 2017 and further winning 10 of the last 12 games, had that led to the ability to draft Luka Doncic, the Bulls still could have been in the running and pushing to trade up in the draft when they ultimately landed in the number 7 slot. But 5 to 6 years later, obviously here we are in search of that next superstar that would be wearing the Bulls uniform. By the way, the idea of this video came about with the news that Barcelona and Mirotic have parted ways after Mirotic, when he actually still had 2 years left on his deal, and also being one of the better players in the league, winning EuroLeague MVP award in 2022. And it brought back all these memories of Mirotic with the Bulls and that season that led to the Bulls winning too many games to avoid landing Luka Doncic. We'd love to hear what you guys think, though. Let me know in the comments if you guys remember that season, as it was a hard season to watch overall. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.